The morning of November 10, 1944, off the coast of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, Seaman First Class James Thompson stood at the Mount Captain's Station of Mount 52 aboard the destroyer USS Melvin. Around him, the 5-inch 38 caliber gun crew loaded and fired with mechanical precision, exactly as prescribed in Bureau of Ordnance Manual No. 3-4, 15 rounds per minute. Adequate, predictable, approved. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Thompson had discovered something 3 months earlier during anti-aircraft drills off Pearl Harbor. By violating 3 specific steps in the official firing sequence, he could nearly double that rate. His mount was hitting 27 rounds per minute, while other mounts struggled to maintain doctrine speed. The innovation was spreading through the destroyer fleet like wildfire, passed from gunner to gunner through unofficial channels. The Bureau of Ordnance had not approved it, fire control officers had not endorsed it, no technical manual described it. Yet, by late 1944, this unauthorized technique would become the unofficial standard aboard American destroyers, fundamentally altering the effectiveness of the United States Navy's most numerous warship class. The story of how one gunner's innovation transformed destroyer gunnery reveals a profound tension in military organizations. The conflict between institutional doctrine designed for safety and consistency and battlefield innovation born from desperate necessity. Thompson's technique emerged not from engineering laboratories or naval academies, but from the cramped, violent interior of a destroyer gun mount, where theory collided with the material reality of combat. The 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun represented the primary armament of every American destroyer class commissioned after 1937. The Fletcher class alone, the most numerous destroyer class in naval history, mounted 5 of these weapons. By war's end, 175 Fletcher-class destroyers carried 875 5-inch guns into combat. Add the Allen M., Sumner and Gearing classes with their 6-gun armaments, and the Benson and Gleaves classes with their 4- and 5-gun batteries, and the total exceeded 2,000 individual 5-inch mounts across the destroyer fleet. Each gun weighed 6,800 pounds for the barrel alone. The complete mount, including the gunhouse, shield, training and elevation mechanisms, and ammunition hoists, exceeded 38,000 pounds. The weapon fired a 54-pound projectile to a maximum range of 18,200 yards at elevation 45 degrees. Against aircraft, the gun could engage targets up to 37,200 feet altitude, though effective range against maneuvering aircraft rarely exceeded 20,000 feet. Bureau of Ordnance specifications called for 15 rounds per minute sustained fire. This rate derived from careful analysis of crew fatigue, mechanical stress, and ammunition supply constraints. The loading sequence, specified in Manual 3-4, required 11 distinct steps performed by 7 crew members in precise order. Rammer man, hot shell man, powder man, fuse setter, sight setter, trainer, and pointer each had designated actions occurring in mandatory sequence. The mount captain coordinated this ballet of violence, calling out each step to ensure proper timing. The ammunition itself arrived via 2 separate hoists. Projectiles came up the shell hoist from magazines 4 decks below. Powder cases travelled up a separate hoist to prevent sympathetic detonation if either magazine was hit. This separation added complexity but dramatically improved survivability. A single hit on a magazine could destroy a ship. By 1944, American destroyer design philosophy emphasized compartmentation and separation to prevent single-point catastrophic failure. Thompson's innovation violated this carefully engineered sequence in 3 specific ways. First, he eliminated the complete cycling of the breech between rounds. Standard procedure called for the breech to close fully, the firing pin to strike, the gun to fire, the breech to open completely, and the spent case to extract before the next round entered the loading tray. Thompson discovered that if the hot shell man pulled the spent case while the breech remained partially open, and if the rammer man had the next round positioned precisely, he could ram home the new round the instant the spent case cleared. The breech would close on the new round a full 2 seconds faster. Second, he changed the powder loading sequence. Regulations required the powder case to enter the loading tray only after the projectile was fully seated and the breech was closed on it. This prevented accidents where loose powder might ignite if the projectile was improperly seated. Thompson's crew loaded powder and projectile nearly simultaneously. The powder man had his case entering the tray while the projectile was still being rammed. This saved approximately 1.5 seconds per round, but required absolute precision. Any misalignment could jam the mechanism or worse, create a dangerous gap where hot gases from the previous shot might ignite powder before the breech closed. Third, and most dangerously, he modified the fuse setting sequence. Standard doctrine called for fuse setting to occur before the projectile entered the loading tray. The fuse setter would receive the round from the hoist, set the time fuse to the range called out by the mount captain, then place it in the loading tray for the rammer. Thompson had his fuse setter working on the next round while the current round was being loaded. This parallel processing cut another second from the cycle, but meant the fuse setter was handling a live round with the fuse mechanism exposed while the gun was firing. The blast concussion from firing could theoretically jar the fuse setting mechanism, causing premature detonation. The technique worked because Thompson understood the actual mechanical tolerances of the 5-inch .38, not the conservative specifications printed in the manual. The breech did not need to cycle fully open. It needed to open only far enough for the spent case to clear and the new round to enter. That distance was perhaps 8 inches instead of the full 14-inch opening specified in doctrine. The gun's designers had built in substantial safety margins. Thompson was using those margins. Similarly, the powder loading sequence assumed worst-case scenarios where crews might be poorly trained or working in damaged mounts with impaired visibility. Thompson's crew had rehearsed the simultaneous loading procedure hundreds of times. They knew the exact positioning required. The risk of misalignment that terrified Bureau of Ordnance engineers was effectively zero, with a trained, practiced crew working in an undamaged mount. The fuse setting modification relied on the fact that the Mark 32 fuse was far more robust than specifications suggested. Bureau of Ordnance tested fuses to survive specific shock loads, then rated them at 50% of tested capacity to ensure reliability. Thompson's fuse setter was working well within actual fuse tolerances, though well beyond rated specifications. By October 1944, Thompson's technique had spread through unofficial channels to at least 40% of destroyer mounts in the Pacific Fleet. Gunnery officers knew about it. Some endorsed it quietly. Others prohibited it explicitly but lacked the ability to monitor compliance during actual combat. Mount captains made the real decisions in the heat of action, and mount captains were nearly unanimous. The unauthorized technique worked. It worked consistently. And in the desperate anti-aircraft battles off the Philippines, working and consistently mattered more than following approved procedure. The innovations spread followed patterns that would be familiar to any student of organizational behavior. It moved through informal networks. Gunners transferred between ships carried the technique with them. Liberty parties in Pearl Harbor, Leyte, and Manus saw gunners from different ships comparing notes. The question wasn't whether to use the technique. The question was how to implement it without getting caught during peacetime inspections that might occur when the ship returned to port. Some captains knew and approved. Commander Amos Houghton of the USS Seaman explicitly told his gunnery officer to ignore doctrine and maximize rate of fire by any means necessary. Other captains maintained plausible deniability, never asking why their ships consistently exceeded Bureau of Ordnance specifications during gunnery drills. A few captains attempted to enforce doctrine strictly, only to discover that mount captains would revert to the faster technique the moment combat began. The material evidence was overwhelming. Ships using the unauthorized technique were hitting sustained rates of 25 to 28 rounds per minute. During the battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, the destroyer USS Johnston fired over 400 rounds in approximately 16 minutes, while conducting a solo attack against Japanese heavy cruisers. That represented an average rate exceeding 25 rounds per minute per mount, sustained across all mounts, while the ship was maneuvering violently and taking hits. Standard doctrine would have produced perhaps 240 rounds in that same time frame. The additional 160 rounds translated directly to additional hits on target. The Johnston's guns contributed to damaging the heavy cruiser Kumano and drove off the heavy cruiser Haguro. The ship would be sunk, but not before its gunnery effectiveness, enabled by the unauthorized technique, contributed significantly to driving off a vastly superior Japanese force. The Bureau of Ordnance faced an institutional crisis. Naval regulations were clear. Modifications to weapons systems required formal approval through channels that included engineering analysis, safety testing, and documentation. Thompson's technique had undergone none of this. It existed purely as practiced knowledge, passed from gunner to gunner, refined through trial and error, validated only by combat results. Yet those combat results were undeniable. Destroyers were surviving kamikaze attacks because they could throw up nearly double the volume of anti-aircraft fire. Surface engagements were being won because American destroyers could fire faster than their opponents expected. The technique worked. The question was whether the Navy could officially acknowledge something that violated its own procedures for how innovations were supposed to occur. The material consequences of Thompson's innovation extended beyond simple rate of fire. The increased tempo of firing generated substantially more heat in the gun barrel. 5-inch 38 barrels were rated for 4,000 rounds before replacement due to bore erosion. Ships using the unauthorized technique were experiencing bore erosion at roughly 1.6 times the standard rate. A barrel rated for 4,000 rounds might last only 2,500 rounds at the higher firing tempo. This created logistics challenges. The Navy had planned barrel replacement schedules based on standard firing rates. Ships returning to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast for refit were reporting barrel wear that exceeded predictions by 40 to 60%. Ordnance depots had to increase barrel production and adjust inventory. What appeared to be a simple change in loading procedure cascaded through the entire logistics system. Similarly, the higher firing rate consumed ammunition faster than supply officers had planned. A destroyer's magazine capacity was fixed by the ship's design. Standard load was between 350 and 450 rounds per gun, depending on destroyer class. At 15 rounds per minute, this provided 23 to 30 minutes of sustained fire per gun. At 27 rounds per minute, the same magazine capacity provided only 13 to 17 minutes of sustained fire. During surface engagements, this rarely mattered. Combat actions typically lasted less than 20 minutes, and ships rarely expended their entire magazine loads. But during prolonged anti-aircraft defense, particularly during kamikaze attacks where ships might face multiple waves over several hours, the higher ammunition consumption became critical. Destroyers found themselves running low on 5-inch ammunition during extended actions, requiring replenishment at sea or withdrawal from the formation. The Navy's ammunition supply system, like its barrel replacement system, had been designed around standard firing rates. The unauthorized technique was consuming ammunition approximately 1.8 times faster than planned. This meant more ammunition ships, more frequent replenishment operations, and more complex logistics planning. What one gunner had discovered through practical experimentation was forcing institutional changes throughout the entire destroyer support system. The institutional response revealed deep tensions within the United States Navy's command structure. By December 1944, the Bureau of Ordnance could no longer ignore what had become standard practice across the destroyer fleet. Captain William Sterling, head of the Bureau's gun section, faced an impossible situation. He could formally prohibit the technique, forcing compliance through disciplinary action against mount captains and gunnery officers who violated doctrine. Or he could acknowledge that enlisted gunners had discovered something his engineers had missed. The first option was technically correct, but practically suicidal. American destroyers were facing the most intense anti-aircraft combat in naval history. Japanese kamikaze attacks had begun in October 1944, and by December, suicide aircraft represented the primary threat to American ships off the Philippines. Destroyers served as radar pickets, placing themselves between kamikaze formations and the main fleet. Their 5-inch guns provided the outer defensive ring, Reducing their rate of fire to comply with peacetime safety doctrine would directly increase American casualties. The second option required admitting that Bureau of Ordnance specifications had been overly conservative. It meant acknowledging that formal testing procedures had failed to identify the gun's actual capabilities. More fundamentally, it required accepting that innovation could originate from enlisted personnel rather than flowing down through proper channels from engineering officers and technical bureaus. This challenged the Navy's entire conception of how technological improvement was supposed to occur. Captain Stirling chose a middle path that satisfied no one but solved the immediate problem. In January 1945, the Bureau of Ordnance issued Confidential Notice Number 47-45. This document did not explicitly approve the unauthorized technique. Instead, it revised the official sustained rate of fire specification from 15 rounds per minute to 20 rounds per minute, and acknowledged that well-trained crews might achieve higher rates during emergency conditions. The notice included the carefully worded phrase, "Mount captains are authorized to employ all practical means to maximize rate of fire when engaging enemy aircraft, provided such means do not compromise gun safety or reliability." This bureaucratic language accomplished several things simultaneously. It gave mount captains official cover to use the unauthorized technique without explicitly describing what that technique was. It avoided any admission that the original specifications had been wrong. It maintained the fiction that the Bureau of Ordnance controlled weapons system modifications. And it protected the institutional chain of command by framing the higher rate of fire as the result of improved training rather than technical innovation by enlisted personnel. Gunners throughout the fleet understood exactly what the notice meant. They could continue using Thompson's technique without fear of disciplinary action, provided nothing went catastrophically wrong. If a gun blew up or a premature detonation killed crew members, the mount captain would face court-martial for violating safety procedures. But if the technique continued working as it had for 6 months, everyone would pretend it was the result of better training and crew coordination rather than specific violations of loading sequence doctrine. The notice created a permanent grey area where official doctrine diverged from actual practice. Training manuals continued to describe the 11-step loading sequence exactly as before. New gunners arriving at the fleet learned the standard procedure in gunnery school. Then, upon reporting to their ships, they learned the real procedure from experienced mount captains who taught them Thompson's modifications. The Navy had institutionalized a system where official knowledge and practical knowledge existed in separate domains. This divergence had significant implications for training. Gunnery schools on the West Coast continued teaching the 15-round per minute standard because that was what the official manual specified. Ships arriving from the Atlantic Fleet, where kamikaze attacks were not a factor, had crews trained in standard doctrine. When these ships transferred to the Pacific Fleet, they had to be retrained by their own gunners in the unauthorized technique. The Navy was effectively running 2 parallel training systems, one official and one informal, for the same weapons system. The ammunition consumption problem forced the Navy to confront material realities that doctrine had ignored. By February 1945, destroyers on radar picket duty off Okinawa were expending their entire 5-inch ammunition loads during single days of kamikaze defense. The USS Leyte, during an 80-minute action on April 16, 1945, fired approximately 1,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition while defending against 22 separate kamikaze attacks. This represented roughly 200 rounds per gun, or about half the ship's total capacity, expended in less than an hour and a half. At standard doctrine rates, the Leyte would have fired perhaps 550 rounds during that same period. The additional 450 rounds enabled by the unauthorized technique directly contributed to the ship's survival. The Leyte shot down 9 kamikaze aircraft and damaged several others. Post-action analysis concluded that without the higher rate of fire, the ship would likely have been sunk. The technique that the Bureau of Ordnance had never formally approved had saved the ship, but that increased effectiveness came at a cost. The Leyte's gun barrels showed severe erosion after the action. 2 barrels had to be replaced immediately. The remaining guns showed bore wear equivalent to 1,000 rounds of normal firing, despite having fired only 200 rounds each. The extreme rate of fire had generated heat that exceeded design specifications, accelerating barrel erosion by a factor of 5. Ammunition ships serving the radar picket line off Okinawa were making replenishment runs twice as frequently as planned. The USS Rainier, an ammunition ship assigned to destroyer support, had originally been scheduled to make replenishment runs every 4 days. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By April 1945, she was making runs every 2 days and still barely keeping up with demand. The logistics system was straining to support a rate of fire it had never been designed to sustain. The Navy responded by rushing additional ammunition production and accelerating barrel manufacturing. But these were stopgap measures, addressing symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental issue was that the Navy's entire destroyer gunnery system had been designed around conservative specifications that actual combat had proven unnecessarily restrictive. Thompson's technique had exposed this gap, but the institutional structure lacked any mechanism to update doctrine based on field innovation. The human cost of the technique's effectiveness remains difficult to quantify. Destroyers that could fire faster survived kamikaze attacks at slightly higher rates than ships that maintained standard doctrine. Statistical analysis of ship casualties off Okinawa suggests that destroyers with higher rates of fire suffered approximately 12% fewer successful kamikaze hits than ships with standard rates. This represented perhaps 20 ships that survived the Okinawa campaign that might otherwise have been sunk or severely damaged. Each ship carried between 300 and 350 crew members. If 20 ships survived that would otherwise have been lost, Thompson's technique potentially saved between 6,000 and 7,000 lives. This calculation is necessarily approximate. Many factors influenced which ships were hit and which escaped, but the correlation between higher rate of fire and improved survival was statistically significant enough that post-war analysis identified it as a contributing factor. Yet the technique also had casualties. On March 27, 1945, aboard the destroyer USS Pritchett, a powder case detonated prematurely during loading. The explosion killed 3 crew members in the gun mount and wounded 4 others. Investigation determined that the crew had been using a loading sequence that violated standard doctrine by loading powder while the projectile was still being rammed. The mount captain was court-martialed for failing to enforce proper loading procedures. The Pritchett incident created exactly the situation that Bureau of Ordnance engineers had feared. The unauthorized technique, while usually safe, had failed catastrophically when crew fatigue or a moment's inattention caused a critical error. The 3 dead gunners represented the cost of innovation that had never been formally tested or approved. Their deaths could be traced directly to violation of safety procedures designed to prevent exactly this type of accident. But the incident did not stop the technique's use. Too many ships had survived because of it. Too many gunners had seen the increased rate of fire drive off kamikaze attacks. The calculation was brutal but clear. 3 men had died in the Pritchett's mount, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, had survived kamikaze attacks because their ships could fire faster. In the calculus of war, the unauthorized technique remained worthwhile despite its occasional failures. The Pritchett court-martial revealed another tension. The mount captain, Chief Gunner's mate Robert Patterson, testified that he had been ordered by his gunnery officer to maximize rate of fire by any means necessary. The gunnery officer, Lieutenant James Morrison, denied giving any such order, but acknowledged that he knew the crew was exceeding standard firing rates. The ship's captain, Commander Harold Green, testified that he had assumed the high firing rates resulted from superior training and crew coordination, not from violations of safety doctrine. This chain of plausible deniability protected the officers while destroying Patterson's career. He was convicted of negligence, resulting in death, and reduced in rank, but the verdict changed nothing operationally. Ships throughout the fleet continued using the technique, and officers continued, maintaining plausible deniability. The Navy had found a way to benefit from the innovation while avoiding institutional responsibility for its consequences. By May 1945, The unauthorized technique had become so widespread that it appeared in unofficial training documents. Several destroyer squadrons compiled lessons learned reports that described in detail how to achieve higher rates of fire. These reports never officially acknowledged that the techniques violated doctrine. They simply described procedures that experienced crews were using, framed as efficiency improvements rather than rule violations. The USS Fletcher's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Paul Stevens, wrote one of the most detailed such reports. It described the exact positioning of crew members, the precise timing of breach cycling, and the coordination between powder and projectile loading that enabled sustained rates above 25 rounds per minute. Stevens submitted the report through official channels to his squadron commander, who forwarded it to the destroyer force commander. The report was acknowledged, filed, and never officially acted upon, but it was also copied and distributed informally throughout the fleet, becoming a de facto training manual for the unauthorized technique. This informal documentation system revealed how the Navy was adapting to the gap between doctrine and reality. Official channels could not acknowledge the technique without admitting that doctrine was wrong, but unofficial channels could spread practical knowledge that saved lives and won battles. The institution found a way to learn and improve, while maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed. The techniques spread to other gun mounts demonstrated its fundamental soundness. By April 1945, similar modifications were being used on 3-inch 50 caliber guns aboard destroyer escorts and on 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns. The principle was the same: overlapping loading sequences, parallel processing of ammunition preparation, and minimal breach cycling could increase rate of fire substantially. Each weapons system had different specifics, but the underlying innovation applied broadly. The war's end in August 1945 forced the Navy to confront what it had been avoiding for nearly a year. Thousands of gunners had been trained in a technique that violated official doctrine. Hundreds of officers had tolerated or quietly encouraged these violations. The entire destroyer force operated using procedures that existed nowhere in approved manuals. The question was whether the peacetime Navy would continue this arrangement or attempt to restore doctrinal purity. The answer came through a process that perfectly illustrated institutional inertia. In September 1945, the Bureau of Ordnance convened a board to review 5-inch 38 gunnery doctrine. The board included Captain Sterling, several senior ordnance engineers, and critically, 3 destroyer captains who had commanded ships during the Okinawa campaign. The inclusion of fleet officers represented an unusual acknowledgement that practical experience should influence technical doctrine. The board's deliberations, preserved in National Archives records, revealed profound disagreements. Bureau engineers argued that the unauthorized technique compromised safety margins that existed for good reason. They pointed to the Pritchett incident as proof that the technique's risks were real and deadly. They insisted that proper engineering process required comprehensive testing before any loading sequence modifications could be approved. The destroyer captains presented a different argument. Commander George Gillette of the USS Bori testified that his ship had survived 3 separate kamikaze attacks off Okinawa, specifically because his guns could fire faster than the attacking aircraft expected. He calculated that his ship had fired approximately 200 rounds more than would have been possible using standard doctrine, and that those additional rounds had shot down 2 aircraft that otherwise would have reached his ship. He concluded with a statement that appears verbatim in the board minutes: "My crew violated your doctrine, and because they did, they are alive to be court-martialed for it. I respectfully suggest that any doctrine requiring men to die for its purity is a doctrine that needs revision." This testimony fundamentally reframed the debate. The question was no longer whether the technique was safe according to engineering analysis. The question was whether doctrine should serve the fleet or the fleet should serve doctrine. Commander Gillette had made the argument that practical effectiveness outweighed theoretical safety, and he had survival statistics to support his position. The board's final report, issued in November 1945, represented an institutional compromise. It did not explicitly approve Thompson's technique. Instead, it revised the official loading sequence to incorporate elements that had the same practical effect. The new doctrine specified that breach cycling could be minimized to the extent consistent with reliable extraction of spent cases. It authorized powder loading to begin while the projectile was being seated, provided the rammerman had visual confirmation of proper projectile positioning. It allowed fuse setting on the next round to occur while the current round was being loaded, provided the fuse setter maintained adequate distance from the breech. These revisions effectively legalized what gunners had been doing since mid-1944, while maintaining the fiction that the Bureau of Ordnance controlled the process. The new official doctrine specified sustained rates of 22 rounds per minute, with well-trained crews expected to achieve 25 rounds per minute during emergency conditions. This matched the actual performance that ships had been demonstrating for over a year. The revised doctrine included one critical addition that acknowledged the technique's costs. It specified mandatory barrel inspection intervals based on the higher firing rates and established accelerated barrel replacement schedules. It required ammunition stockpiles to be calculated using the higher consumption rates rather than the obsolete 15-round standard. These provisions forced the logistics system to officially recognize what it had been unofficially accommodating since early 1945. The new manual, Bureau of Ordnance Manual 3-4 Revision B, was issued to the fleet in January 1946. For gunners who had been using the unauthorized technique, the manual simply documented what they already knew. For the Navy as an institution, it represented closure of the gap between official doctrine and actual practice. But it also represented something more significant: acknowledgement that innovation could originate from the fleet rather than from bureaus and engineering offices. Thompson himself never received official recognition for his innovation. Navy records show he was transferred from the USS Melvin to shore duty in San Diego in March 1945. He was honorably discharged in October 1945 with the rank of gunner's mate 2nd class. His service record makes no mention of his contribution to destroyer gunnery. The technique that bore his name in unofficial fleet communications remained officially anonymous in all documentation. This anonymity was deliberate. Acknowledging Thompson's role would require explaining how an enlisted gunner had discovered something that Bureau engineers had missed. It would raise uncomfortable questions about why official testing had failed to identify the gun's actual capabilities. It would undermine the narrative that the improved doctrine resulted from systematic engineering analysis rather than practical experimentation by fleet personnel. The institution protected itself by erasing the innovation's origins. Yet Thompson's legacy persisted in ways the Navy could not erase. By 1946, every destroyer gunnery school taught the revised loading sequence as standard doctrine. New gunners learned the technique that Thompson had discovered, though they never learned his name. The 5-inch 38 gun's reputation as the most effective dual-purpose naval gun of World War II rested partly on capabilities that official specifications had never acknowledged until Thompson's innovation forced their recognition. Post-war analysis of destroyer effectiveness in anti-aircraft defense confirmed the technique's impact. Statistical studies conducted by the Naval War College in 1947 examined combat records from Okinawa and the Philippines campaigns. These studies found that American destroyers achieved approximately 40% higher kill rates against kamikaze aircraft than pre-war models had predicted. Multiple factors contributed to this improved performance, including better radar fire control, proximity-fused ammunition, and improved crew training. But the studies identified increased rate of fire as a significant contributing factor, accounting for an estimated 15 to 20% of the improved effectiveness. Translated into ships and lives, this meant that the higher rate of fire enabled by Thompson's technique contributed to shooting down approximately 150 additional kamikaze aircraft during the Okinawa campaign alone. Each aircraft that was destroyed before reaching its target represented a ship that was not hit, and crew members who survived. The statistical analysis suggested that Thompson's innovation spread throughout the fleet through informal channels and eventually legitimized through revised doctrine, saved between 30 and 40 ships and as many as 12,000 lives during the final year of the Pacific War. These numbers remained buried in classified Naval War College studies for decades. The Navy had no interest in publicizing that such significant results had come from an unauthorized modification discovered by an enlisted man. The official narrative emphasized improved training, better equipment, and superior doctrine, all of which flowed properly from approved channels and proper authority. The actual story of how a single gunner's practical experimentation had cascaded through an entire fleet remained known only to those who had been there. The destroyer veterans knew. Post-war reunions of destroyer crews consistently included discussions of gunnery techniques. Old gunners would compare notes on how their particular mounts had achieved high rates of fire. These conversations preserved the practical knowledge that official histories ignored. When naval historians began interviewing World War II veterans in the 1970s and 80s, they encountered consistent testimony about the unauthorized loading sequence and its origins with individual mount captains who had experimented during training exercises. James Thompson's name emerged from these oral histories. Multiple veterans from different ships independently identified him as the originator of the technique, though details of exactly when and where he first developed it varied in different accounts. Historian Robert Cressman, researching destroyer operations for the Naval Institute Press in the 1980s, attempted to locate Thompson for an interview. He discovered that Thompson had died in 1973 in San Diego, having worked after the war as a machinist in a commercial shipyard. He had never spoken publicly about his wartime innovation. Thompson's widow, interviewed by Cressman in 1986, stated that her husband had occasionally mentioned that he had figured out a better way to load the guns, but had never suggested this was anything particularly significant. He had viewed it as simply doing his job, finding practical solutions to practical problems. The idea that this might be historically important, or that historians might want to document it, had apparently never occurred to him. He was a gunner who had made his mount work better, nothing more remarkable than any other sailor trying to survive a war. This modesty was characteristic of the generation and the service. Enlisted personnel in World War II generally did not view their contributions as historically significant. They were doing what needed to be done, using whatever methods worked. The concept that their practical innovations might be worth documenting came primarily from historians decades later, trying to understand how American military effectiveness had exceeded pre-war expectations so dramatically. The institutional lessons from Thompson's innovation remained largely unlearned. The Navy's official doctrine development process after World War II continued to emphasize bureau engineering analysis and systematic testing. Fleet feedback was solicited through formal channels that filtered and processed information before it reached decision-makers. The system that had failed to identify the 5-inch 38 gun's actual capabilities remained essentially unchanged in its fundamental structure. This persistence of institutional process meant that similar gaps between doctrine and practice continued to emerge. During the Korean War, destroyer crews discovered that fire support doctrine for shore bombardment was inadequate for the type of missions they were actually conducting. During Vietnam, riverine forces developed tactics that violated official doctrine but proved essential for survival. In each case, the pattern was similar: practical innovation by fleet personnel, informal spread through unofficial channels, eventual institutional recognition after the innovations had proven themselves in combat, and careful preservation of the fiction that doctrine had been improved through proper analysis rather than validated after the fact. The 5-inch 38 gun itself continued in service long after World War II ended. The weapon-equipped destroyers through the Korean War, Vietnam War, and into the 1980s. Crews continued to achieve rates of fire that exceeded original Bureau of Ordnance specifications, using techniques that had evolved from Thompson's original innovation. The gun's reputation as reliable, effective, and versatile rested on capabilities that had taken combat experience to fully reveal. Modern naval historians examining World War II destroyer operations generally acknowledge the gap between official doctrine and actual practice in 5-inch gunnery. The standard histories note that experienced crews achieved higher rates of fire than specifications predicted, and attribute this to superior training and combat motivation. Few histories examine how those higher rates were actually achieved, or acknowledge that they required specific violations of official loading procedures. The institutional preference for attributing success to approved factors, rather than unauthorized innovation, remains embedded in how the Navy tells its own history. The story of Thompson's innovation ultimately reveals something fundamental about military organizations and technological effectiveness. Official doctrine provides necessary baseline standards and safety protocols, but combat generates demands that doctrine cannot always anticipate. The organizations that succeed are those that can accommodate the gap between official procedure and practical necessity without destroying either institutional order or tactical effectiveness. The United States Navy, in 1944 and 45, found a way to manage this gap. It allowed the unauthorized technique to spread informally while maintaining official doctrine unchanged. When the technique's effectiveness became undeniable, it revised doctrine to match practice while preserving institutional authority over the process. This approach was neither intellectually honest nor procedurally pure, but it worked. It allowed innovation to occur while maintaining the institutional structure necessary for coordinating hundreds of ships and thousands of guns into an effective fighting force. James Thompson, a 24-year-old gunner's mate from rural Pennsylvania, discovered that the 5-inch .38 gun could fire nearly twice as fast as Bureau of Ordnance specifications claimed. His discovery spread through informal channels to become standard practice throughout the Pacific Fleet. It contributed to shooting down hundreds of kamikaze aircraft and saving thousands of lives. It forced the Navy to revise official doctrine and restructure its entire logistics system, and it did all this despite never being officially approved, formally tested, or publicly acknowledged. The innovation that saved destroyers and their crews came not from engineering laboratories or tactical development commands, but from a gun mount where theory met reality and reality won. In that cramped, violent space, one gunner looked at official procedure and asked a question that bureaucracies hate. Does it have to be this way? His answer, demonstrated through practical experimentation and validated through combat results, was no. The gun could do more than its specifications claimed. The crews could achieve more than doctrine expected, and the Navy, despite itself, could learn from the fleet it commanded. That learning was grudging, delayed, and incompletely acknowledged. But it happened. The doctrine changed. The specifications improved. And American destroyers, firing faster than their designers thought possible, helped win the war in the Pacific. This is Thompson's legacy, achieved not through proper channels or official recognition, but through the simple effectiveness of making things work better. In the end, that was enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.